At 31 years old, Verity Calloway owned nothing in the world but a black morning dress gone thin at the elbows, a carpet bag with a broken clasp, and $11 folded small inside her glove. It was her husband's own mother, Verity Calloway, who put her out of the house on Larkspur Road, saying plainly that a wife who could not keep her husband safe had no claim left on his family's roof. 2 years a widow by then, Verity had learned to make $11 do the work of 100. And so when the yard master at Hollow Creek Junction offered to sell her a rusted, forgotten railroad car sitting dead on a weed-choked siding, a private car nobody wanted, not even for scrap, she paid him $9 and signed the bill of sale before he could think better of it. Folks in town called it a foolish, pitiful thing, a widow woman setting up house in a wrecked railroad car like some vagrant. They did not know that beneath its warped floorboards lay proof of a love everyone, Verity included, had believed was buried 2 years deep in the Nebraska ground. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Verity Calloway. If you have ever found something the world called worthless, only to discover it was carrying more truth than anything you owned, tell us about it in the comments below, for those are usually the things worth keeping. The years before that April morning had not prepared Verity for cruelty of quite that particular kind, the kind delivered calmly over a breakfast table by a woman who had once, however coldly, called her daughter. Verity had not been born to comfort, and so she had never expected life to hand her any. She came into the world in a soddy outside Ashwell, Nebraska, the only child of a schoolteacher and a fiddle maker, both of whom died of the same winter fever when she was 9 years old, leaving her to the care of her mother's sister, a widow named Prudence Ives who ran a boarding house near the rail depot to keep herself and now her niece fed. Prudence was not a soft woman, but she was fair, and she taught Verity 2 things that shaped the whole of her character: that a person's worth was proven in the mending, not in the boasting, and that a debt of kindness once given was owed until it was paid back in full, even if the paying took 20 years. Verity grew up with flour on her hands and a needle always somewhere in her apron, turning collars for boarders, patching trousers for railroad men passing through on the long haul west, and listening, always listening, to the stories those men carried with them like extra baggage. She was not a beauty in the magazine sense, but she had a steadiness in her gray eyes and a way of looking at a person as though she had already decided to think well of them. And more than one traveling man found himself lingering an extra day at Prudence Ives's boarding house on the strength of that look alone. It was in the winter of 1879, when Verity was 21, that Thomas Calloway first came through Ashwell, sent ahead by the Prairie and Midland Railroad as an aide to the division's superintendent. A serious, sandy-haired young man of few words who nonetheless noticed that Verity mended a torn cuff so neatly a person could not find the tear afterward. He was not wealthy, not yet, only a clerk with good handwriting and a head for figures, but he had ambition without cruelty in it, which Verity had learned by then was rarer than either money or good looks. The superintendent's private car, a handsome varnished thing called the Meridian, sat over on the siding whenever business kept the line's officers in Ashwell for a spell. And because young clerks were not permitted to call on respectable young women unchaperoned, Thomas arranged, with the superintendent's amused permission, for Verity to be received aboard that car of an evening, her aunt seated primly in the corner with her mending, while he and Thomas talked over ledgers and Verity listened, and now and again was asked her opinion, which pleased her more than any compliment on her face could have done. It was in that car, beneath a brass lamp that swayed gently even when the train stood still, that Thomas first told her he intended to marry her, not as a question exactly, but as a plain statement of fact, the way he might report a schedule, and Verity had laughed at the boldness of it even as something in her chest turned over entirely. Prudence Ives, watching from her corner with her mending forgotten in her lap, would say afterward that she had never in her life seen a young man state his intentions with less romance and more certainty, and that this, more than any bouquet or borrowed verse, was what convinced her the boy meant to be a good husband, since a man careless with the truth rarely troubled himself to be so plain about his heart. They were married the following autumn in the little frame church at Ashwell, and if Verity Calloway had reservations about her son marrying an boarding house niece with no dowry and no family name worth mentioning, she kept them in those early years mostly to herself. Thomas rose steadily in the railroad's employ, becoming first a dispatcher and then an assistant to the roadmaster at Larkspur Ford, the town where his own family had settled 2 generations back, and Verity came to live in the Calloway house on Larkspur Road, a square white house with green shutters that oddly ruled the way some women rule a church congregation, with quiet, relentless authority. Verity bore the small slights of those years, the corrections about how a Calloway wife ought to fold linens, the comments about her plain sewing being fit for a boarding house but not for company, because Thomas, when the door was closed and it was only the 2 of them, made her feel that none of it mattered, that she was the one steady thing he had chosen for himself in a life otherwise governed by timetables and other men's orders. He was not a demonstrative man, not given to poetry or long declarations, but he had a habit of leaving small folded notes in her sewing basket on mornings he left before dawn for the yards, notes that said little more than that he had been thinking of her on the walk to the depot, and Verity kept every one of them in a cigar box beneath their bed, a quiet ledger of a devotion that asked for no audience. What made Verity worthy of whatever second chance life might later offer her was not any single virtue so much as the accumulation of small, unwitnessed ones. Her patience with Ottilie's coldness, her refusal to speak ill of her mother-in-law even when provoked, her habit of sending part of whatever little pin money she had back to her aging aunt in Ashwell, and above all her loyalty to Thomas, which did not waver even when, in the last year of his life, a strange distance crept into him that she could not account for and that would later be twisted into something far uglier than the truth deserved. By the spring of 1887, Thomas had been offered and had quietly declined a promotion that would have taken him east to the railroad's central offices in Omaha, a fact he told no one but his immediate supervisor, William Hastings, a fellow clerk turned yard official who had known Thomas since their earliest days at the Ashwell Depot, and who kept his friend's confidence out of respect for reasons Verity would not understand until much later. Thomas told Verity only that he preferred to stay near Larkspur Ford, and she, trusting him completely, asked no further questions, never guessing that his refusal had planted in his mother's mind an unspoken, festering suspicion that something was being hidden from the family, a suspicion that would harden into blame the moment tragedy gave it somewhere to land. The tragedy came in October of that year, on a stretch of track 2 miles outside Larkspur Ford where a summer of hard rain had loosened the shale above a cut through the bluffs. Thomas had gone out with the section crew himself, against his mother's later insistence that a man of his position had no business riding a work train through unstable ground, to inspect a report of shifting earth before the evening express was due to pass. The slide came down without warning, taking the work train's forward car with it, and Thomas Calloway did not come home that night or any night after. The men of the section crew told it afterward in low voices at the depot, how the ground had simply let go without warning, how the forward car had gone down into the cut in a matter of seconds, and how nothing recovered from that slide had been whole enough to explain to a young widow exactly how her husband had spent his last morning. Verity was 29 years old and a widow before the leaves had finished turning, and in the raw first weeks of her grief, Verity Calloway, who needed somewhere to set the unbearable weight of her own sorrow, found it easiest to set it upon her son's wife, declaring in the hearing of half the town that if Thomas had accepted the transfer to Omaha as any sensible man would have, none of it would have happened, and that it was for Verity's sake to stay near a woman with no family of her own. That he had refused it and gone, in the end, to his death on that unstable track. It was a cruel arithmetic, and not even a true one, but grief rarely troubles itself with proof, and by the spring following Thomas's death, Verity had made her feelings a matter of practical consequence. The Larkspur Roadhouse had been Calloway property since Thomas's father's day, deeded to Verity outright upon her husband's death years before, and Thomas, trusting he had decades ahead of him to see to such matters, had left no will naming Verity any portion of it. There were no children to soften Ottilie's resolve, no grandchild's face to remind her of tenderness. And so, on a gray morning in April, not 18 months a widow, Verity was told to pack what was hers, which amount. Ted to her clothing, her sewing basket, her aunt's old cigar box of folded notes and precious little else, and to be gone from the house by week's end. Verity did not argue. She had learned long before that arguing with Verity Calloway was like arguing with weather, and instead she went to stay briefly with a cousin of her aunt's in the rail town of Hollow Creek Junction, a day's travel west, where nobody knew her name or her sorrow, and where $11, carefully hoarded from mending work taken on in secret through that last hard year, was the whole of her fortune in the world. It was at Hollow Creek Junction, in the yard behind the depot, that Verity first saw the car. It sat alone on an overgrown spur track that the railroad had long since stopped using, its once fine paint gone gray and paling, its windows filmed with 2 winters of dust. A private car retired from service so long ago that even the yard master, a broad, kindly man named Otis Fenwick, could not say with certainty which official it had once belonged to. He told her, when she asked idly what would become of such a wreck, that the railroad had marked it for scrap and would be glad to see it hauled off the siding for whatever a body cared to pay, since it earned them nothing sitting there rotting. Verity, who needed a roof more urgently than she needed pride, walked its length twice, noted that the frame beneath the peeling paint was sound oak and iron, and offered him $9 on the spot, which Otis Fenwick, surprised and not unmoved by a widow's practical courage, accepted with a handshake before she could reconsider. She moved in within the week, sweeping 2 winters of dust from a floor that still, beneath the grime, showed the ghost of fine parquet work, and scrubbing soot from windows that let in, once cleaned, a startling amount of good prairie light. The car smelled at first of mice and cold iron, but beneath that faint and stubborn of cedar and old varnish, a smell that tugged at something in her memory she could not yet name, and she told herself it was only the smell all such old cars must share, the way all barns smell alike of hay and leather regardless of which farm they stand on. It was on her 3rd evening there, working a rag along a brass fitting beside the door to loosen its tarnish, that she felt beneath her fingers a small, deliberate roughness in the metal, and rubbing away the grime she found, cut crudely but unmistakably into the brass, 2 initials and a small carved heart. TC, and beside it, the single letter V. Verity sat back on her heels in the lamplight and stared at that mark for a long while, her breath gone thin, because though she told herself it might be coincidence, some other man's initials, some other woman's, she knew even as she reasoned against it that her hands had traced this exact brass fitting once before, on an evening 8 years gone in a car with a swaying lamp, where a serious young clerk had first told her, as plainly as a schedule, that he meant to marry her. She did not sleep that night, turning over in her mind the impossible, aching coincidence of it, that of all the retired cars on all the sidings in the territory, she should come to own, for $9 desperate, the very car in which she and Thomas had first courted, the superintendent's old car called the Meridian, renamed and reassigned so many times over the years that its history had been scrubbed as clean as its paint, until nothing remained to mark what it had once meant except one small carved heart that some careless hand, hers or his, she genuinely could not remember which, had cut into a brass fitting one winter evening when they were young and certain of everything. It took her the better part of 2 weeks, working in stolen hours after her mending work for the town's few paying customers was done, to go over every inch of that car with the thoroughness of a woman piecing together a life she thought she already knew by heart. She found in a cupboard behind the small stove an old railroad ledger left behind by some long-departed official, and tucked among its pages a single photograph of the superintendent's staff from years back, in which she recognized, standing stiff and young at the edge of the group, a face she had once loved past all sense. It was the discovery of that photograph, more than anything, that set her searching in earnest, running her palm along seams in the floor she might otherwise have overlooked. And it was in doing so on a rainy afternoon in early May that she noticed one board beneath the built-in berth sat a fraction higher than its neighbors, its grain not quite matching the boards around it, as though it had been cut and refitted by a hand less skilled than whoever had built the rest of the car. She pried it up with the flat of a kitchen knife, her heart working harder than the task alone should have demanded, and found beneath it a shallow cavity built into the car's frame, dry and cedar-lined, holding a small tin box no larger than a Bible. Inside that box, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone soft with age, Verity found a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, every one of them addressed to her in Thomas's own careful, upright hand, none of them ever sent. The letters, 23 in all, spanned the final year of Thomas's life, and reading them by lamplight, one by one, Verity came to understand that the husband she had buried had been carrying a weight of devotion and worry so private he had not trusted even her with it while he lived. The earliest letters explained, in his plain, unhurried way, why he had refused the transfer to Omaha the railroad's central office had offered him. Not because he lacked ambition, but because he had learned, quietly and through his friend William Hastings, that the promotion would place him for 2 years training under a division president notorious for treating his officers' wives as ornaments to be paraded at company functions. And Thomas, knowing how Verity had suffered enough scrutiny already under his mother's roof, had decided he would rather remain a modest roadmaster's assistant at Larkspur Ford than subject her to a society that would judge her plain hands and quiet manner as unfit. He had told no one the real reason, not even Verity, because he did not want her to feel she had cost him anything, and had let his mother and the town believe whatever they liked about his staying, preferring their misunderstanding to Verity's guilt. Deeper in the bundle, the letters turned toward a plan Thomas had been assembling in secret for 2 years, saving what he could from his salary without his mother's knowledge, because Ottilie had firm opinions about a Calloway wife having nothing of her own, and Thomas had grown weary of watching Verity ask permission for pin money in a house that ought to have been half hers by marriage. He had been purchasing, in small increments and under the name of a lawyer friend in Omaha to keep it from local gossip, parcels of land along a proposed new rail spur north of Larkspur Ford, land that speculators had not yet noticed was likely to triple in value once the spur was approved, intending it as a foundation for a house that would be entirely, legally, unassailably Verity's own, a promise written plainly in the 12th letter. That she would never again live under a roof where she had to earn her welcome by being agreeable. The final letters, written only weeks before the slide that took him, spoke of a deed nearly finished, of a surprise he meant to reveal to her that Christmas, and of one more matter he asked almost shyly for so plain a man that she forgive him for keeping any of it secret at all, since secrecy had never once come easily to him except in the single matter of loving her exactly as much as he did. Beneath the letters, wrapped separately, Verity found the deed itself, a legal document for 40 acres along Willow Spur, drawn up not in Thomas's name alone but jointly in his name and hers, Verity Calloway, dated the spring before his death, and beside it a single letter in a different hand entirely, a woman's hand signed with the name Louisa Calloway Pratt, which Verity did not recognize until she read the letter through and understood, with a fresh wave of grief and relief tangled together, that Louisa was Thomas's own cousin, a woman he had quietly corresponded with for help managing the land purchases through her husband's law office in Omaha. Correspondence that anyone reading only the envelopes, as apparently someone once had, might easily have mistaken for the letters of another woman entirely. The seed, Verity now realized with a cold understanding, of a rumor that had once reached her only as vague, unkind whispers she had been too grieving to chase down at the time. Reading further, Verity found that Thomas had even accounted in his careful clerk's hand for what he called the risk of his own foolishness, writing that he knew a man could be thrown from a horse or caught beneath a slide before any plan came fully to fruit, and that should such a thing happen, he wanted her to know it had never once been a small thing to him, the marrying of her, and that whatever anyone in Larkspur Ford ever said afterward about his reasons or his heart, the truth would always be sitting quietly in this box, waiting for her to have the patience to find it, exactly as she had always had the patience for everything else in her life that mattered. Verity pressed that particular page to her chest for a long while before she could bring herself to read on. The last item in the tin box was smaller than the rest. A plain gold ring, not matching her own wedding band, engraved inside with a single date, 1 week ahead of the Christmas Thomas had never lived to see. And Verity understood without needing any letter to explain it that her husband had meant to renew his vow to her that season. Formally, publicly, as a second wedding of sorts to mark the completion of the land and the house he had been building toward in secret for 2 long years. Verity carried that tin box to bed with her that night and did not sleep, weeping in a way she had not allowed herself since the week of the funeral, not from fresh sorrow but from something nearer to vindication. The discovery that every cold season of doubt Ottilie had planted in the town's mind. Every unkind word about a wife who had somehow cost her husband his ambition and then his life had been not merely unfair but flatly, provably untrue. Her husband had not been drifting from her. He had been building toward her, in secret, with a patience that put her own to shame, right up until the hillside above Larkspur Ford gave way beneath him. Knowing the truth and proving it to a skeptical, gossip-fond town were two different labors entirely, and Verity understood this even in the first flush of her discovery. The deed named her jointly, which meant Willow Spur's 40 acres were, by law, at least half hers, but Verity Calloway had spent 18 months building a version of events in Larkspur Ford in which Verity was, at best, an unlucky wife and at worst, the quiet cause of her son's fatal recklessness. And a woman does not undo 18 months of settled opinion with a tin box alone, particularly when the man who could confirm her story lay 2 years in the churchyard. Worse, Verity soon learned that she was not the only one who had taken an interest in Willow Spur. A land agent and sometime banker named Ezra Prout, who had quietly been buying up parcels along the proposed spur route himself, discovered through the county recorder's office that a joint deed existed in the name of the late Thomas Calloway and his widow, and rather than approach Verity honestly, he called first upon Ottilie, reasoning correctly that the mother would be easier to persuade than the wife. Prout suggested to Ottilie, with the smooth patience of a man accustomed to getting his way, that the deed was likely some clerical confusion, that Thomas had surely meant the land as family property under Ottilie's own name as his mother and next of kin, and that Ottilie, as a Calloway acting for the good of the family name, would do well to contest any claim Verity might raise before it grew into an embarrassing spectacle in the newspapers. Ottilie, still raw with grief she had never properly examined, and stung at the thought that her son had kept secrets even from her, found it easier to believe Prout's flattering version than to imagine her plain, quiet daughter-in-law capable of anything so bold as producing genuine proof. And so when Verity came to Larkspur Ford that June to present the deed and letters before the county recorder, she found Ottilie already waiting there with a lawyer of her own, prepared to argue that the letters were forgeries, and the deed a fraud perpetrated on a grieving widow by an opportunist. The recorder's small office filled that morning with more onlookers than the county's business usually drew, farmers and shopkeepers alike finding sudden reason to have papers filed, and Verity, standing alone at the clerk's counter with a tin box under her arm and her mother-in-law's lawyer eyeing her carpetbag as though it might contain further evidence of fraud, felt for the first time in 2 years something other than grief rise up in her. A plain, stubborn refusal to be made small again in a room where the truth happened to be sitting, however inconveniently, in her own 2 hands. It was William Hastings, by then station master at Hollow Creek Junction and the one man alive who had known the true reason for Thomas's refused promotion, who came forward at that hearing, quietly and without any wish for credit, to confirm before the recorder that Thomas had confided in him years before both his reasons for staying at Larkspur Ford and his plan to secure land in Verity's name, and that he, Hastings, had in fact witnessed and countersigned the original deed transaction in Omaha as a favor to his friend. Hastings had said nothing of this in the 2 years since Thomas's death, not from indifference, but because Thomas, in the last conversation the 2 men ever had asked him to say nothing unless Verity herself ever had need of the truth, A promise Hastings had quietly kept through every season of watching her struggle, telling himself it was not his place to hand her a secret that was rightfully her husband's to give. Even with Hastings's testimony, Prout did not yield easily, producing his own hired expert to cast doubt on the ink and paper of the letters. And for a tense fortnight the matter hung unresolved while the town of Larkspur Ford, hungry for scandal, took sides according to old loyalties, some declaring Verity a clever schemer, others recalling, now that it was mentioned, how devoted Thomas Calloway had always seemed to his quiet wife and how lit. That devotion had matched Ottilie's later account of him. The turn came not through any lawyer's argument but through Ottilie Calloway herself, who, invited privately by Hastings to read the full bundle of letters before the final hearing, out of what he later admitted was simple mercy rather than strategy, sat alone one evening in her son's old room and read every one of the 23 letters her son had written and never sent, learning for the first time the real reason he had refused Omaha: the years of quiet saving, the cousins' misread correspondence, and the ring engraved for a Christmas he never lived to see. Whatever hardness 18 months of grief had built in Ottilie Calloway did not vanish all at once, but it cracked enough that when the final hearing convened, she rose before the recorder, her lawyer visibly startled beside her, and stated plainly that she withdrew her contest of the deed, that she had been wrong to doubt her son's widow, and that whatever the county's ruling, she wished the record to show that Thomas Calloway had loved his wife with a constancy his own mother had failed in her grief to see clearly. The recorder ruled within the week that the deed was valid and entirely Verity's own. 40 acres along Willow Spur confirmed in her name alone, the joint tenancy passing to her outright as the surviving party, and word of it traveled through Larkspur Ford and Hollow Creek Junction faster than any train on the line, carrying with it not only the news of Verity's restored fortune, but the fuller, truer story of a plain roadmaster's assistant who had spent his last 2 years building, board by board and dollar by dollar, a promise he fully intended to keep. Prout, his scheme exposed and his reputation for fair dealing badly dented, quietly withdrew his own claims to the surrounding parcels rather than face further scrutiny. And within the season, the railroad spur was approved exactly as Thomas had once quietly predicted it would be, turning Willow Spur from a forgotten stretch of prairie into land worth a genuine fortune. All of it now unmistakably Verity's to do with as she chose. Ottilie Calloway, for her part, did not ask for any portion of it, nor did Verity offer to withhold what little grace remained possible between them. And in time the two women arrived at something short of warmth but longer on honesty than they had ever managed while Thomas was alive to stand between them, meeting now and again over tea to speak of him plainly, as two women who had loved the same good man rather than as accuser and accused. She chose in the end not to sell it, but to build there on a low rise overlooking the very rail line her husband had died inspecting, a modest square house with a wide porch and green shutters not unlike the ones on Larkspur Road, except that this house belonged to her alone, deeded in her own name, answerable to no mother-in-law's approval. She had the old railroad car, the Meridian, hauled up onto the property on a spur of its own, refusing every offer to sell it for scrap or salvage, because whatever else it had also been the place where a serious young clerk once told her, as plainly as a schedule, that he meant to marry her. And later, the place that had kept his last unspoken promises safe for 2 long years until she was ready to find them. She converted it eventually into a small depot house where travelers waiting on the Willow Spur line could take tea and warm bread while they waited. And she kept, framed above the old brass fitting with its carved heart, the 23rd letter Thomas had written, the one that asked only to be forgiven for any secrecy, in a place where she could see it every morning she rose. William Hastings did not court her that first year, nor the second, holding to some private conviction that a woman ought to be let finish grieving thoroughly on her own schedule and not another man's hopeful one. And it was not until the 3rd autumn, when the Willow Spur depot house had become a modest local fixture and Verity herself had grown easier in her laughter than anyone in Larkspur Ford had ever thought to see her, that he finally admitted, awkwardly and without any of Thomas's plain confidence, that he had loved her himself for longer than he cared to say, and had kept his silence about it out of the same loyalty that had kept him silent about the letters, not wanting to press upon a grief that was not his to hurry. Verity, who had learned by then that the finest devotion rarely announced itself loudly, told him she had noticed his patience for exactly what it was some time before he found the courage to name it, and that she considered a man who could keep two such difficult promises, his friend's secret and his own heart, in equal and unbroken silence for years, to be exactly the sort of man worth a second chance. He proposed to her in the end not aboard any fine car with a swaying lamp, but on the wide pour. CH of the house Thomas's own patience had made possible, on an ordinary evening with no occasion to it at all, and Verity thought, accepting him, that there was a certain rightness in being asked so plainly, twice now, by two different good men, in two entirely unremarkable moments that she would nonetheless remember for the rest of her days. So it was that Verity Calloway, who had come to Hollow Creek Junction with $11 and a broken carpetbag clasp, found herself some years later mistress of 40 valuable acres, proprietress of a depot house built from a car everyone else had called worthless, and in time wife again, this time to a quiet station master who had guarded another man's promise so faithfully that he very nearly forgot to make one of his own. The town of Larkspur Ford, which had once whispered that Thomas Calloway must have tired of his plain wife, came in the end to tell a rather different story to travelers passing through, of a railroad man who loved so steadily and so privately that his devotion outlasted his own life, hidden beneath a floorboard for 2 winters until his widow was ready to find it, and of the promise he had made her to give her a home entirely her own, that not even a landslide nor his mother's grief, nor a greedy speculator's scheming had ever managed to break. Thank you for spending this time with Verity's story. And if it moved you even a little, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and perhaps leave us a comment telling us this. Has there ever been a promise made to you, spoken or unspoken, that you only came to understand and appreciate long after the person who made it was gone? We read every one of your answers, and we will be back soon with another story worth settling in for. Until then, take care of yourselves, and take care of the quiet promises still waiting to be kept in your own life.